do. So let me get started again. My name is Steve Blank. I'm the editor and publisher of Slate Media, and I would like to welcome everyone to a very important discussion that we're having this evening on the rise of anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of with a very special guest, Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League and author of It Can Happen Here. Helping me begin our discussion is the ADL's Long Island co-chair, Leslie Decker, who will have the honor of introducing Jonathan. Leslie?
Thank you, Stephen. And on behalf of ADL, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. My name is Leslie Decker, and I am proud to serve as the co-chair for ADL Long Island. We are a group of volunteers who are active on Long Island on the issues that Jonathan will speak about tonight, and the broader work of ADL, which fights anti-Semitism and hate in all its forms. If you wish to join our group, simply send a request to newyork@adl.org. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker for this evening, Jonathan Greenblatt. Jonathan Greenblatt is CEO and National Director of ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the world's leading anti-hate organization with a distinguished record of fighting anti-Semitism and advocating for just and fair treatment to all. Jonathan joined ADL in 2015 after serving in the White House as Special Assistant to President Obama and Director of the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation, and after a distinguished career in business as a successful social entrepreneur and corporate executive. Since becoming CEO, Jonathan has modernized ADL while refocusing it on the mission it has had since its founding in 1913, to fight the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. Under Jonathan, ADL has modernized its operations, innovated its approaches to counter anti-Semitism from all sides, and enhanced its efforts to combat extremism in all forms. He brings the full breadth of his experience to his new book, which will be the focus of his presentation tonight. It Could Happen Here: Why America is Tipping from Hate to the Unthinkable and How We Can Stop It. The format tonight will be a conversation between Stephen and Jonathan. I am sure it will be a very interesting, important, and insightful discussion. Thank you all for attending tonight's program.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Very much appreciate your participation. Before we get started, I want to thank once again Northwell Health for helping make this event possible, and as well as our other events. So let me just jump in. It's a very provocative title of your book, It Could Happen Here, a play of Sinclair's Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. Tell us about what is the current threat? Where are we right now in terms of anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance?
So first of all, let me thank Leslie for that kind introduction, and let me thank you, Stephen, for organizing this evening tonight, and for Blank Slate Media for enabling it, and Northwell for supporting. I'm really delighted to have the chance to be in dialogue with you, and look forward to lots of provocative, tough questions from the audience. So people should feel free to bring it on. But let's first talk about the state of hate in America. And I think, the data is pretty troubling by almost any measure. I mean, look, I will start by reminding people the ADL is the oldest anti-hate group in the country. We've literally been at this work for more than 100 years, having been founded in 1913 in the wake of a Jewish man being falsely accused, wrongly convicted, and ultimately torn from his jail cell and hung from a tree outside of Atlanta. And as that man, literally, his corpse was still swinging from the branch, the community gathered around and held a picnic at the site of his lynching. And they took photographs of his body, and they turned them into postcards they gave out as souvenirs. So 100 some odd years ago, the American Jewish community, they were weak and vulnerable. And when the founders came together to create the ADL, their intention was, as they wrote in their mission statement, these aren't my words, they were written in 109 years back, that the purpose of this organization would be to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. So this organization has been on the front line of fighting anti-Jewish hate, as well as other forms of intolerance, for longer than any other group in America. And yet, we can't ignore the fact that while America is a wonderful place for its Jewish community, we enjoy so much privilege, we're able to worship freely, we're able to work where we want, live where we choose. In so many ways, there's never been a democracy, the state of Israel withstanding. In the last 2,000 years, it's been as open, as inclusive to us as this democracy has been. But the numbers don't lie. And what we've seen in the last 2 years, Stephen, is absolutely alarming. After nearly a 15-year decline, in 2016, the number of anti-Semitic incidents in America spiked 34% year over year, about 1,267 incidents. And then in 2017, they surged to 1,986 incidents. That's a dramatic 57% increase year over year. Amazing. And then that was the year, of course, of Charlottesville. In 2018, they dropped maybe 5%, but that was the year of Pittsburgh, the most violent anti-Semitic act in American history. And then in 2019, they went up another 12%, Stephen, 2,107 incidents, the highest number we've ever seen in 40 years. And then in 2020, despite the fact that we were all home social distancing, college campuses were closed, businesses were shuttered, people were staying at home, the number did drop. I mean, we expected it to plummet. In fact, it only decreased 4%. It was still the third highest total we've ever seen. And while I can't tell you yet what 2021 numbers are, we're still tallying that up. We saw, like in the month of May, around the fighting in Gaza, we had Jews being attacked, beaten and brutalized in broad daylight, right here in New York City, or in Los Angeles, or in Las Vegas, or in other places across the country. And we saw May 2021, 115% increase over May 2020. And, these threats are coming, Stephen, from all sides. It's not just, it's the far right, it's the radical left, it's political Islamists, it's like religious fanatics. I mean, I can go and there's certainly a straight line, Stephen, from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh, to Poway, to Jersey City, to Muncie, New York, to Capitol Hill, to Colleyville, Texas. And again, the perpetrators and their motives may have been different, but in each of these instances, we saw ugly expressions of anti-Jewish hate. Now, I'll just say the Jewish community, despite the fact that we're some 2% of the overall US population, we are nearly 60% of the hate crimes that are focused on faith. So we experience a kind of victimization that far outproportioned to our numbers. And yet we'll also keep in mind that this is happening against a backdrop of a broader increase in hate. The FBI tracked a 12% increase in hate crimes in 2020. And whether it's anti-Black hate or anti-Asian hate, we're seeing it in lots of different categories. And, this work is really dramatic. At ADL, we're a retail organization, Stephen. We get a lot of criticism, if you will, for statements we make or positions we take. We can talk about all that. But on a daily basis, through our 25 regional offices across America, we are on the ground, responding to incidents, working with communities who are affected, training law enforcement, engaging kids and parents. Like last year, we responded to more than 9,000 anti-Semitic incidents across the country. That's a live person engaging, interviewing, consoling, supporting the victims of these crimes. So that's what we do day in and day out. And the work, I got to say, we've never seen anything quite like this moment before.
So we know historically there has been in this country and around the world, there has been anti-Semitism. We have a long, long history of racism and other forms of intolerance. What is it about now? What is driving this hate for Jews? What is driving the hate for other groups, Blacks, other religions, other groups?
So I think there are a few things that are contributing to this moment in time. So number one, I think you see polarization. And polarization is the product, I think, of cable news, developments in Washington, and so on and so forth. But you've seen a degree of polarization in the public conversation that we haven't had in decades and decades, if ever. And all the data tells us this. And in a polarized environment where people are on edge and with sort of, systemic problems like the economic gap between the haves and the have-nots, right? Or the continuing complexity around healthcare, or even climate change to a degree, or the pandemic is a good example. These big problems which our systems seem unable to solve. People look for scapegoats to blame, to explain the unexplainable.
I mean, there's an elephant in the room that we had a president who based his campaign right from the start on white grievance and grievance to other groups. And this had and the frightening thing about it is that there was a very large audience.
Yeah, well, I mean,
so how much, there is, I know that we can discuss what's happening on the left with college campuses and the attacks on Israel. But when you have a leading political figure, somebody who was president of the United States, basing a campaign on that,
yep.
How much is that not a major factor in this?
So I think you start with political polarization, which started before Donald Trump. I think secondly, you have, again, the politicization of hate. Donald Trump is exhibit A in that, is exhibit A. If you say unhinged things about minorities or George Soros or whatever, don't be surprised when unhinged things happen. And President Trump had the biggest pulpit of anyone in the United States of America, right? Literally any leader in the world, arguably. And so I think his invocation of stereotypes directed at Jews or not opened the door to extremists. He emboldened extremists. And I'll come back to that in a second. And I think also, Stephen, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So I think you see a craziness on the other side. President Trump's bully pulpit was unmatched, okay? And he coarsened the conversation in ways that no president had ever done. Some people call that authentic, but I can tell you about the minorities who were targeted. The minorities who were mentioned, they felt targeted. They didn't feel like he was being authentic. They felt like he was being bullying, and that played out, and so number one, political polarization, okay, which creates space for stereotyping. Number two, the weaponization of hate and anti-Semitism specifically. Number three, extremists exploited that moment. So from the alt-right in 2016 on the campaign to Alex Jones and all the other uglies who were swept in that period of time after Trump won. And I know they were emboldened, Stephen, because at ADL, we track the extremists. And they said, we're emboldened. And when the White House did inexplicable things like gave press credentials to anti-Semitic media outlets or, repeated crazy tropes, they felt encouraged. Now, by the way, again, I need to say the exploitation of this moment wasn't extremists on the right, extremists on the left. The things you hear about Israel if I had any hair, they'd make my hair stand on end. I mean, the comments, the level of vituperation and viciousness is mind-bending. And again, they play into the moment where the conversation's coarsened. The fourth thing I think that's real in this moment is social media. Social media is a super spreader of extremism and intolerance. From Facebook to TikTok, from Twitter to, Reddit. I mean, the level of antipathy that it enables and how it amplifies the worst voices, it algorithmically elevates them. It's engineered to drive clicks. And that creates this kind of doom loop, Stephen, where the worst voices are amplified. So people click so that they get more amplified. And the failure of Facebook, which deserves a fair degree of blame for this, to deal with this issue appropriately is a lot of the reason why we're in this fix today.
One of the things it seems that I guess it's scary to think about is the fact that this type of speech, this type of hate is good for business, good for politics. It's become good for politics. It's been driving. Facebook thrives on clicks, and nothing drives that better than anger and hatred.
You're right.
And in politics, you have somebody who came down the escalator talking about Mexicans coming across the border and raping us. One of the things that I was interested in the ADL is the fact that as an organization, you may have started with an act of anti-Semitism, but the organization has also taken on and opposed other forms of hatred and intolerance in other areas. Can you discuss that? Because that's a little different, because you have organizations that are very specific. And yes, you work very hard on anti-Semitism, but you don't leave the other parts out. And how important is that to the organization and its approach?
I'm glad you asked the question. It's fundamental to our approach. It is indivisible to our strategy because it's embedded, it's encoded in ADL's DNA. When we were founded, as I mentioned, 1913, they wrote this mission statement, right? Which it compels us not just to stop the defamation of Jewish people, but also to secure justice and fair treatment to all. So ADL's rooted at the core in this notion that the Jewish people can only be safe if all people are safe. And unless all minorities are protected, the Jewish minority will never be protected. I mean, this picture over my shoulder here is of the CEO of the ADL, my predecessor, Ben Epstein, standing next to Dr. King and next to RFK, next to the head of the NAACP and President Johnson in the Rose Garden in 1964 around the signing of the Civil Rights Act. Like, that's ADL's history. Long before I was born, ADL was doing this work. And so today, when I speak out on behalf of migrant children separated from their families at the border, that isn't beyond the remit of ADL. In fact, Ben Epstein, Stephen, was on Liberty Island on October 3rd, 1965, when LBJ signed the Immigration Act. And why was he there? Because ADL had been advocating for immigration reform since the 1950s. President John Kennedy wrote a book that many of your audience have probably read, A Nation of Immigrants. In 1957, he wrote that for ADL. We commissioned that. So when I speak up against the Muslim ban, when I speak up on behalf of migrants, because ADL remembers that we were once strangers too. And today, when I'm advocating not just safety through security, I mean, I was proud when Rabbi Charlie, after the hostage crisis last month in Texas, in his first interview, after he survived, on CBS Morning News on Monday morning, he thanked the FBI, law enforcement, and the ADL for the training that saved his life. And so our Center on Extremism monitors the extremists. We delivered over 1,300 tips to law enforcement last year to preempt potential crimes. So we believe in safety through security. We need to make sure that our religious institutions, our community centers, our communal offices like ADL, we get bomb threats, Stephen, We get death threats. We must be safe. But we also believe at ADL safety also through solidarity. We need to realize that as a Jew, for those of you who are watching who are Jewish, there are only some 7 million Jews in America, a country of 340 some odd million people. If we don't realize that our fate is intertwined with others, I got to tell you, you can't do arithmetic. There's just no question in my mind that we need to create common cause with other communities. And our success in this country, in the greatest democracy in human history, has absolutely, inextricably been linked to our ability to work with our Christian brothers and sisters, our Black brothers and sisters, Latino brothers, and all of that. I mean, I just think we're foolish to imagine we can go this alone. So I think ADL, Stephen, believes so, again, I have fought for and will continue to fight for election protection, or again, immigration rights. Because again, these are our issues. If you care about anti-Semitism and protecting this democracy, you better show up, for others as well.
Now, what you said in the book, the reference to it could happen here, explain that. What's to the level, there are different threat levels that the Defense Department has in terms of mobilization of troops. When you say it can happen here, what is it? What can happen here? And you're talking about the unthinkable. What is the unthinkable in your mind in this country?
Well, let me answer that question by telling a story, if I might.
Sure.
So, and the book opens with a vignette about my experience going back to the town Magdeburg, where my paternal grandfather, Bernie Greenblatt, was born and raised. So my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor from Germany. And when he was a young man, he never could have imagined that the only country, before the rise of the Third Reich and the Nazi death machine, that the only country he ever knew would one day turn on him, Stephen, regard him as an enemy of the state, destroy everything that he ever loved, slaughter almost his entire family and network of friends, and force him to come to this country as a refugee. When he was a young man, he never could have contemplated that one day his grandchildren, me, my brother, my cousins, would be born in this country. He never could have imagined that it could happen there. Flash forward 20 some odd years ago. No, a little less than 20 years ago, but more like 30 years ago. My in-laws and my wife come to this country. They are Jews from Iran. My wife was born and raised there. It's the only country that they ever knew. And they never could have imagined that one day, before the rise of the Islamic Revolution and Khomeini's death machine, that the country would one day turn on them, regard them as enemies of the state, destroy everything that they ever loved, and force them to flee for their lives and come to this country as refugees. When he was a young man, my father-in-law never could have contemplated that his grandchildren one day, my kids and my nieces and nephews, would be born here in this country. He never would have guessed that it would happen there. So Stephen, when you ask me, what is the it? Stephen, I don't think it's unthinkable for me as a Jew to imagine that one day my grandchildren might not be born here. That this country, the only one that I've ever known, the only one that I've ever loved, could one day change so dramatically that it forces me and my family to flee. I can't even contemplate that, but my history as a Jew, based on not some theory, not some like ancient text, Stephen, but my grandfather's story, my wife's story, tells me that it could happen here, and the only way we stop it is we roll up our sleeves and get engaged. That's the only way to prevent the unthinkable.
There is that history that many people carry of that unthinkable that was not believed, that people could not imagine it happening, even as they're going through it. What do you see in this country that is that just a residual carrying that forward, or are there things that are taking place on the ground that lead you to believe that something that horrific that would force you and your family to leave this country could occur?
Well, I mean, I never could have imagined I would one day see people rampaging through our Capitol building. But I got to tell you, I would describe that as the most predictable terror attack in American history. And the idea that these individuals would literally try to kidnap or have the intention to kidnap and kill legislators and then barge through, assault police officers and barge through the doors of the Capitol, try to break down the temple of our democracy. I never could have guessed that. So if that isn't a sign that something is profoundly off, I don't know what is. But you don't have to, I mean, again, that should be enough, I think. And yet, if you look at the data, we've seen data which suggests that a large number of individuals think political violence is not just excusable, but rational in certain conditions, or might even be plausible in our present time. Violence against people who hold different views from them. And I see the Holocaust distortionism on a daily basis where people are comparing COVID-19 precautions to the Nuremberg laws, which is insane. And then I hear people, we just had a situation on the college campus in Chicago, comparing the Israel Institute, which funds Jewish studies programs, to like a settler colonial something or other. I mean, or as if Israel was committing genocide. If you believe these unhinged things, Stephen, that COVID precautions are the Nuremberg laws intended to dehumanize and enslave us, or if you believe these crazy things, like the Jewish state is committing genocide against another people, like that gives you the license to do the unthinkable here and now. Because wouldn't you stand athwart and try to stop genocide? Wouldn't you try to stop the Nuremberg laws? I mean, the penchant for hyperbole creates a space where I do believe the unimaginable can take place. So was I surprised when, again, people rampage to the Capitol? Yes, I was. But at ADO, we track the extremists, okay? And I read their rhetoric, and I have the good fortune or the misfortune to watch their videos, and I know what they're saying. And if you think tyranny is upon us, you will do revolutionary things. And if you think genocide is happening, you will do, crazy things. So I'm afraid that unless our elected officials, unless public figures can sort of dial down the drama and return us to some degree of normalcy, like we shouldn't be surprised when the wheels start to come off, because that's the environment that's being curated all around us on a daily basis.
I think I saw Jamie Raskin on a program quoting Voltaire saying, if you can get somebody to believe in absurdity, you can get them to commit an atrocity. I thought that was very powerful, and I think along with what you said.
By the way, can I just say one other thing?
Sure.
Again, I interviewed Barbara Walters, professor at UCSD, in my book. She studies civil wars around the world. She'll tell you that the indicators suggest that you could have a civil war here. Like the indicators that she's seen in places like Bosnia or like the former Yugoslavia or some countries in Africa, she sees them here. I interviewed Gregory Stanton, a former professor at George Mason down in Virginia, an expert in genocide. He thinks all the indicators are here in ways he's seen in countries around the world, like in Myanmar and in Rwanda and in other places. So I kid you not, like I think the alarms bells need to be going off. I'm not yelling fire in a crowded theater. Like I'm in the theater and I smell smoke. And that's why I wrote the book. We have got to get engaged. I think, Stephen, sometimes we believe, kind of like the subway, okay? Or the miracle of air traffic, or like the way our roads work. We've lived with these things for so long, we think they're the natural state of being. Or electricity. Stephen, do you know how the electricity really makes it to your house? Have you ever studied with the precision of like a civil engineer how the grid works? And I say this because we take for granted these things. They didn't just happen. Somebody designed it, people built it, people maintain it. Our democracy is the same way. Our civil society is the same way. These aren't preordained, by Hashem. These aren't granted by nature. These are carefully constructed systems that if we don't attend to them, like the way one puts oil, in your engine, to the extent you have a car that runs on gas, or the way that we maintain our garden. If you don't maintain the garden, weeds will grow, the rodents will eat your vegetables, and it won't work. Our democracy is the same way. Our shared society is the same way. This stuff only works if we support it, if we sustain it. And if we fail to do that, we shouldn't be surprised when things begin to unravel.
There is, in your book, you present these problems in stark relief. At the same time, you're providing suggestions, recommendations on how to respond to that, how to combat that. Before we get there, though, there's also this other thing that's going on in terms of banning of books, banning of curriculum. Part of what I think you had recommended is that we educate each other,
yes,
that we inform each other about what's going on. But we have this whole movement of people trying to stop the teaching of the Holocaust, stop the teaching of slavery, the banning, I think, in Tennessee of a book, Mouse, Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novel about the Holocaust. How do you counter, this? It's almost sort of trying to keep people ignorant. There are states that are just saying, we're not going to teach the Holocaust, we're not going to teach slavery. How do you combat that?
I mean, I must say, I think it is terrifying, terrifying, that people are trying to somehow erase history, pretend as if it didn't happen. Look, I know there is a hue and a cry in many parts of the country about CRT, and I get that. I mean, in as much as I think you see overreach in some places, we've seen that, like I'm here in Manhattan, many private schools right here, like in this city, have their curricula seem to be captured, like almost overrun, if you will, by overzealous people who don't want to teach the classics and have a warped view of things. That being said, the answer is not to burn the books. The answer is not to stop teaching hard things. I'm reminded, you laid out some of the recent moments, right? Like that situation in Tennessee, which is what led to the Whoopi Goldberg situation, which we can talk about if you're interested. But I think more about the situation in Texas, where a teacher was recorded telling other teachers that you need to teach, if you're going to teach the Holocaust as if it were an optional thing, you have to teach both sides. There are no two sides to the Holocaust. There was one side, the Nazis, systematically annihilating the Jewish people across the continent of Europe and into Africa. And they would have exterminated our entire people if they had won the war. I mean, so there are no two sides. And these individuals who think that somehow a kind of illiberalism and erasure will solve our problems are sorely mistaken. Is it John Dos Passos, whoever, who said those who don't learn the mistakes of history are doomed to repeat it? I think I'm butchering that. Maybe it's Santayana. Maybe it's Santayana. I mean, I think it is profoundly problematic, this sort of again, I get back to this point I was making, that extremism and illiberalism kind of go hand in hand. And I would invoke that Newtonian principle. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So like at the ADL, we're fighting these ethnic studies curricula that erase Jews or that actually promote anti-Semitism. But the answer can't be, okay, so don't teach any ethnic studies anymore. And ignore the fact that our country was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. I mean, that's the truth. And systemic racism is real. And if we're trying to understand how to create a more inclusive society, I mean, I'm all for, by every stretch of the imagination, Dr. King's vision of a colorblind world. But if you want to build that beloved community, I'm sorry, we need to reckon with the longstanding legacy of slavery. And the fact that if you look at literally any of the socioeconomic or educational indicators, you know, African-American youth perform profoundly worse, like on every dimension. That's not an accident. That didn't just happen. You can go back to the funding of these schools. You can go back to the municipal laws in these places. I mean, there's a long-standing set of deeply embedded biases that create these conditions. Now, again, if we want to address racism and hate, we need to make sure we understand where we're coming from so we know where we're going. So I'm very much alarmed by this tendency of some to, again, try to, as they would erase the Jewish experience over here, try to erase our history over here. None of that is helpful.
You mentioned it in the Whoopi Goldberg, which is kind of an interesting situation, and it goes to the teaching of history and understanding of history, which seems to have really been lost. Because by all accounts, Whoopi Goldberg has been somebody who's been supportive of Jewish causes. Mayor Bloomberg came to her defense after she made her comments. But can you discuss that? Because you came into that discussion where Whoopi Goldberg said the Holocaust is about man's inhumanity to man. And you responded to that very forcefully. Can you discuss your response and also your take of Whoopi Goldberg, who, by all accounts, is not somebody who is hostile to Jews, but still made something that was very wrong?
Yes, I mean, so I don't know what Mayor Bloomberg said, so I can't comment on that. But basically, Whoopi Goldberg was making this comment, by the way, in a conversation about the book Mouse that you mentioned a moment ago. And she described the Holocaust as man's inhumanity to man and not about race. That's like saying slavery was about man's inhumanity to man, or the genocide of Native Americans was about man's inhumanity to man. The reality is, it was actually all about race. Now, maybe not in the way that Whoopi Goldberg or some people think about race in the context of America 2022, when so often this is a binary between black and white. In reality, like if you open the book Mouse, I don't have it here in front of me, but you open the book Mouse, on the first page, Stephen, is a quote from Adolf Hitler, which says the Jews, I'm paraphrasing, but basically says, the Jews are definitely a race. They are just not a human one. I mean, it was a kind of racialized anti-Semitism that Hitler promoted, this notion that there was a master Aryan race and the Jews were a subhuman race. That was what he said. It was born out of the kind of eugenics movement of the 19th century, which believed that there were these racialized differences between people, tried to break us down as if there were species of Homo sapiens, and the Jews are at the bottom of that hierarchy. So she got it wrong. And then she also said, in the context of not the conversation on The View, but when she went on Colbert later that evening, that it was actually white on white. It was a fight. It was white on white fight. It was a fight between white people. Okay, it wasn't a fight between two groups. Again, the Jewish people were systematically slaughtered, right, at a degree and scale, an industrial scale that we had not seen before in human history. So it wasn't a fight between two even groups at all. And secondly, this whole idea that Jews are white, again, that's imposing this lens that we use in this country, in this moment, talk about these issues. Race is a social construct. It's not a real thing. There isn't really a white race or a black race. I mean, and there isn't really a Jewish race. This is just a way of seeing the world. And again, I think a very warped one. The reality is that Jews, whether it's like a faith-based anti-Semitism that the church and the crown used to put out there to rationalize their hatred and persecution of the Jews, or race-based anti-Semitism that Hitler and others and white supremacists promulgate today to justify their persecution of Jews, or political anti-Semitism that anti-Zionists and Israel's opponents use today to promulgate their hatred of the Jews. Hatred of the Jews is the theme that we see that's present through all of these. So when I engaged with Whoopi on this, and after she apologized, I accepted her apology, Stephen, because I believe, as you said, she doesn't have a history of anti-Semitism, far from it. Because furthermore, I believe that she did so with authenticity. She invited me on the show to speak with her the following day. And then finally, I did so because of the Jewish value of teshuvah. Like Jews, we as a people of our faith believe in this value of repentance, that we're all fallible, that we all err, and that part of that process is accepting the apology when someone offers it in a genuine, sincere way and helping them to learn. So what I must say is that, I think it's great to have the opportunity to talk to thousands or hundreds of thousands of people on Twitter, which I do. I don't know how many followers I have on Twitter, but hundreds of thousands. More important to talk to the 5 million people who watch The View every single day. And that created a conversation about anti-Semitism and frankly, race that I think we needed to have in this country. That's played out over the last several weeks. So that was a good development. Now, should she have been suspended? I don't know. I would have liked to seen The View take on the issue of anti-Semitism, Stephen, not just for 10 minutes on that one show, but maybe every day for the next 2 weeks. Maybe develop an education guide for kids in classes to talk about this. Maybe do a series where they look at other forms of hate on a regular basis. Maybe, as I said, bring a Jewish host on The View who can represent our case in a way. I'm not exactly the target demo, I think, for the program. They probably find somebody who's a little bit better suited to do this on a daily basis rather than Jonathan showing up for once. So I think that it was a learning opportunity. I hope to goodness we can keep having these kinds of conversations. And frankly, as I said at the start of this, Stephen, I'm grateful for you for hosting me here tonight so we can engage this kind of dialogue, because I hope people find it helpful.
There may be some cases, and there is the overt things where there are attacks, there are shootings, people putting swastikas, same thing with other groups. There's also a lot of subtlety. And I think you've addressed that, and you mentioned in some cases, and where it's not that obvious, where somebody is attacking Israel, which you do have. It is a country. Israel, like any country, will do bad things as well as good things.
Sure.
So there's legitimate conversation and criticism there. But then there is the motive. Sometimes you're just dealing with motives. When somebody is criticizing Israel, they're really criticizing a country for doing wrong. On the other hand, there are people that are criticizing Israel because they don't like Jews. How do you, in that situation, it becomes sort of that gray area, and it's kind of the dog whistle. It's the idea that if I'm not overt, that I can get away with more. How do you address the not overt, not to get in the way of somebody criticizing, having legitimate criticism, but how do you kind of see where that is? What is what it is, and how do you address that situation?
So there's a lot to unpack here. One of the claims that Israel's critics like to say is, "Oh, anytime I criticize Israel, I'm accused of being anti-Semitic." That is total baloney. And that's just not true. That's a canard. That's a fiction that people put out there to kind of inoculate themselves from criticism. I also hear, I think AOC was saying this, or Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was saying this over the weekend. Palestine, nobody can talk about Palestine. I don't think nobody criticized Israel. She said something like that. Like, I don't think there is a topic, foreign policy topic, talked about as much as Israel and the Palestinians, literally. I think if you looked at the amount of news coverage on this versus the Ukraine for the last 2 weeks, I mean, give me a break. The reality is it is talked about all the time. The reality is plenty of people criticize policies of the Israeli government in ways that are totally not anti-Semitic. And the reality is, if you look at the way that the winds blow, I think it used to be that people would say, oh, I don't have a problem. I mean, I hear this a lot. People like on the far right, they say, I don't like, I think the Jewish people aren't legitimate. I think the Jewish people manipulate events. I think they have, they're conspiratorial, Stephen. The Jewish people are manipulating events, controlling things. The Jewish people should go back to, Israel. They should get out of America and leave. And then I hear on the far left people say, I don't have a problem with the Jewish people. It's just the Jewish state that's illegitimate. It's just the Jewish state that's manipulating events behind the scenes. It's the people in Israel. They should go back to Poland. You hear that too. I mean, literally, you could almost do a search and replace. And the criticisms that one side lobs that are clearly myths and tropes against Israel, many extremists on the other side lob against, the Jewish state. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary, the parallels, the symmetry. Look, there are plenty of ways to criticize Israel policy, Israeli government. In fact, here's a little tip for your viewers. If you're interested in a website you can go to, where you can see how do I criticize Israel, not be anti-Semitic. Let me direct you to this one. It's called adl.org. Because like last week, I criticized the fact that I think the Israeli government needs to do more to deal with violence, settler, impelled violence on the West Bank. I think as a Zionist, and let me be clear, I am an unapologetic Zionist. I am proud to be a Zionist, and I deeply believe in the right of the state of Israel to exist. That's all that Zionism means. It's been characterized as an ideology. Look, it means you believe in the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. If you believe in the right of the Palestinian people for self-determination and not the Jewish people, I would describe that as anti-Semitism. Because I also believe the Palestinians have a right to a state, Stephen. I do. I think they deserve to have a state that provides them with dignity and equality, even as there is a Jewish state that provides Israeli Jews with safety and security. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. I think they're inherently linked. I really do. But to get back to your earlier question, so Jonathan, how do we know when it's anti-Semitism versus just, a very harsh critique? I reference, the 3D test. It's not my idea. It was a test conceptualized by Natan Sharansky, who was, the prisoner of Zion, who escaped the Soviet Union and now, lives in Israel, where he's been in public service for many years. He says, number one, if the criticism demonizes, if it demonizes the Jewish state or the people in that state, right? Demonize them, regards them as subhuman. Number two, if it delegitimizes them, if it seems to be trying to make the case that they don't deserve the right to even exist, that it somehow criminalizes Zionism. And number three, if it holds Israel to double standards. Like, again, you can be passionate about these issues, but if you don't believe that the same rules apply to Israel that should apply to Syria, if you're not attacking or calling out what's happening in Syria or Yemen, right, which are far graver humanitarian crises than what's happened in the West Bank over the last 70 years, then you have to ask yourself, if you're demonizing, delegitimizing double standards, these things often are tip-offs, Stephen, that there's something else going on. Now, all that being said, you could have someone who's passionate about the topic of Palestinian rights. I'll grant you that. You could have a person whose ancestors or themselves was displaced by the founding of the state of Israel. I'll grant you that. I don't expect such people to want to march down Fifth Avenue in the UJA Israel Independence Day parade. I mean, who would? But the reality is, even if you have those feelings and you are promulgating anti-Zionism as an ideology, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It is. I mean, maybe in the context of a college seminar on 19th century theories of nationalism, it isn't. I'll grant you that, absolutely. And again, you can have very strong feelings about the Jewish state. If you've been directly affected by it, you care about human rights, I understand that. But whether with intention or simply impact, I see it all the time. The anti-Zionists engage in tropes which end up endangering Jews. We saw it play out again in this country last May when Jews were being beaten and brutalized in broad daylight by people not wearing MAGA hats, not, holding, coming from Richard Spencer's events. These are people coming from anti-Israel events. Like, if you think it's normal if you don't agree with it, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia does, but you think it's wrong, right, to vandalize a mosque, it is. To protest in front of a mosque, it is. If you think it's wrong what China is doing to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang or how they suppress democracy in Hong Kong, but you also think it's wrong to beat up elderly Asian people, it is. Or to protest, Chinese scholars at universities, it is. Then you also, I think, have a moral obligation to say it is wrong. It is wrong to somehow blame American Jews for what's happening in the Middle East, to excuse or dismiss violence perpetrated against them, or vandalism at college hillels or local synagogues, or the harassment that Jews here in Brooklyn face every single day. So all I'm saying here, Stephen, is if you don't engage in an equanimous way, if you simply choose to target the state of Israel, if you simply choose to hold it to standards you don't hold other countries to, if you focus on delegitimizing its very existence, but have nothing to say with, I don't know, this country or so many others which have colonial pasts which are wretched and real. And again, if you would demonize all Israelis, try to boycott them, try to prevent them from participating in public life, the problem isn't them, it's you.
In terms of responding to things, when you see things, and I can see that you have no difficulty responding to these things and are a powerful voice, and we thank you for that. But there is the question of people not responding. They're not joining the people at storming the Capitol, but they're not saying anything about it. They're not decrying that. You have Republicans, for whatever reason. Democrats are not afraid to criticize Donald Trump for doing it, but Republicans are afraid of the base in many cases, and you're not hearing that response. What is the responsibility? And what is the saying for evil to triumph? All you need is for good men to stay silent. How important is everybody, regardless of whether it's politically comfortable or uncomfortable, to speak out in the face of things like the Proud Boys? They actually came to Rockville Center out here in Nassau
I remember
County.
that.
And there was silence. All the Democrats criticized it. Nothing was said by Republicans, any of the officials. I'm not saying that they supported these guys, but they didn't say anything about them.
Well, look, I think, in my opinion, Stephen, there should be nothing political in calling out prejudice. There's nothing partisan in exercising and enforcing some pretty basic principles like decency, like equality, like respect. Our country was built on these very basic values. So again, I don't want to get political here, but I don't have any patience, and I don't think history will judge very kindly elected officials who stand down or are silent in the face of intolerance. I think all of us have an obligation to call out hate when it happens. I really deeply believe that, whether it's in your Facebook feed or at the water cooler or in the locker room or at the dinner table, let alone in the public square. So I don't think history will judge these people very kindly for the abdication of moral leadership. I think these times demand all of us. Things are moving so fast, Stephen, so fast. Back to Facebook, I mentioned it earlier. Facebook reports hundreds of billions of messages every day on their platform. Think about that. Hundreds of billions of messages. The numbers are at a scale that we simply can't comprehend. We can't. So I say that because all of us would be well served to take a breath, take a beat, and when we see something, say something, and focus less on the mania of social media or like the political, fashion du jour, and come back to very basic values.
What is the, what do you think, this is a question from somebody in our audience. What is the actual, when you say people could be, what is that, you said that you can't imagine not living here, but what could happen? Are you talking civil war? Are you talking about the potential is that there's going to be armed conflict in the streets? We've seen the rise of authoritarianism. We've seen political movements where we're looking to overturn a democratically elected president. Is that the threat? Is that we're not going to be a democracy? Is that the threat that there could be groups that are scapegoated the way Jews were in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. So I think, look, I wrote the book because I think you're seeing there's a fact pattern afoot, and it's impossible to ignore the evidence. I think you could see, I mean, look, we saw some of this after George Floyd, but it wasn't systematic and it wasn't strategic. I think you could see civil unrest. I think you could see outright violence. I think you could see individuals and groups being targeted and victimized at the scale we have not previously dealt with. This is literally why I wrote the book. I mean, the book literally is like a handbook of learnings from ADL. I lay out the case in the first half of the book about how the kind of bedlam could unfold here in this country based on what I've seen, again, through the lens of my family's experience, based on what I've seen through the prism of ADL in our work, based on what I've seen looking at examples. I talk about a white supremacist who was exposed, and I tell that story. Or I talk about an Islamic fundamentalist, people like that who came back from the brink. And then I use the second half of the book to share strategies, to offer tactics and tips about what we can do. So if you're a parent, or you're an educator, or you're a member of the clergy, or you're a small business owner, or a corporate chieftain, or you're a nonprofit leader, or you're an elected official, I have a chapter on each of these about what you can do to confront hate and to help us turn the tide before it's too late. So I don't think the stuff that the American berserk that I envision in the book, I'm afraid isn't so far away anymore. But I do think it can be averted. But like, here's the thing, Stephen, this is, if there's any takeaway from this talk for your viewers, democracy is not a spectator sport. You can't watch it from the cheap seats, up in the bleachers, like eating your popcorn, and think it's all going to work out. Democracy is a contact sport. You need to be on the field, and all of us have a role to play. Everybody doesn't have to be the quarterback. Everybody doesn't have to be in the offensive line, if you will. But all of us need to realize that if we don't get on the field, this game is not going to go the direction that we like. And I think we've learned the price. We've seen the price. And the Jewish people uniquely have felt the price of watching kind of liberal democracies and otherwise stable societies unravel, whether it was in Europe or in the Middle East. And I think we can't afford to let that happen here. And again, I hope that my book provides and lays out the case, Stephen. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic wand we can wave that will make this go away. But if we roll up our sleeves and use a whole of society strategy, I do think we can turn back the tide. And I hope we do it before it's too late.
At the risk, if I can, of going too far beyond our allotted time, just anything else, you've given a good start, and you dedicate a large part of the book. It Could Happen Here, available on bookstores everywhere. But the thing that you can tell people what they can do, being engaged is one thing. What are the things that as a good citizen, as somebody who wants to oppose this, as somebody who wants to combat this, what are, and you have many, many ideas in your books, but give us some of the top ones that people should start practicing now.
Well, look, there's so much in the book, but I'll give you a way of thinking about this, maybe, if that helps, Stephen. I think, and this is a heuristic that we use at ADL. Number one, speak out. When you like that, what's that expression? When you see something, say something. Speak out when you see hate happen. Again, whether it's in your Facebook feed or in a Twitter thread, or on Craigslist, speak out. That could mean flagging that Facebook post or that tweet, that prejudiced tweet. That could be, again, interjecting in a conversation over the water cooler. And speak out in particular, Stephen, when it is coming from your side of the table, if you will. So I think liberals need to speak out when they hear progressives saying things that are prejudiced. I think conservatives need to speak out when other conservatives are saying things that might be hateful. I say this because we are more likely to create change when we recognize it within and be constructive within our own ranks rather than just pointing fingers at the other side. And neither side of the spectrum is exempt from intolerance. It's not both sides to note that it doesn't matter how you vote, it matters what you value. And there are plenty of people with problems on both sides of the spectrum. So number one, speak out. Number two, share facts. Resist the inclination to share some crazy Facebook post from your mother's neighbor's uncle about the fact that COVID-19 is a bioweapon or masking, reduces your fertility or all this craziness. We all need to dial down the drama. Like I said, deep breath, take a beat, treat people online like you would if they were with you in person, with respect, with decency. And then thirdly, in addition to speaking out and sharing facts, show strength. Show strength means leaning in on these fights. It means standing up as an ally for others, not just for yourself, your own community. And it means getting engaged. So show up at that school board meeting, not to scream about, again, masking guidelines, but maybe in a sensible, smart, measured way. Talk about how to improve the climate in the school. Maybe run for that school board. Maybe vote in the school board election. Right? Maybe volunteer for that school board. Now I'm just talking about school boards here, but there are so many ways. Our civil society depends upon the contributions of all of us to sustain it. So donate to a cause you care about. Volunteer for an institution whose work you appreciate. Vote in the election. Run for office. Participate. Not just in the things that make you happy, but the things that you care about in your community. I do believe, Stephen, that I'm going to get it wrong, but it's that adage of the starfish. The boy walking down the beach is full of starfish washed up on the shore. Little boy is throwing starfish back. Millions of starfish on the man walks up and says, "What are you doing? Why are you bothering?" It doesn't make a difference. There's so many. Can't possibly do them all. And the little boy says, throws him back, has made a difference to that one. I believe that small acts can build into, I believe it starts with small acts and it builds into a movement. So I think showing strength is about leaning in. It's about engaging. It's about, again, remembering that we all have a stake in this democracy. And that old lotto commercial, Stephen, you got to be in it to win it. Same goes for our democracy.
Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for this very important discussion at really a pivotal point in this country's history. I'd like to also thank all those who attended, asked their questions. I'd like to again thank Northwell for making it possible. For those who were unable to watch, if you know anyone, a recording of our discussion can be found on our Blank Slate's website, theisland360.com, our Facebook page, and our YouTube channel. A story about this evening's event will appear in the 6 Blank Slate Media newspapers next week. And I hope you will all also join us next month. A month from now, March 17th, we're going to be sitting one-on-one with the North Hempstead's new town supervisor, Jennifer DeSena. Things have gone very exciting in North Hempstead. When they come in before, people are engaged. I hope you'll join us then. And again, I want to thank Jonathan Greenblatt for this discussion. I highly recommend that you get a copy of It Could Happen Here, both for the presentation of what the threat is and also a way to combat that threat. Jonathan, thank you again for participating in our event.
Thanks for your time tonight. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed the conversation.